to give further details pending the autopsy. Now, he'd been working for the Secret Service since 1965, which is a fairly long time. So I'm just wondering if this was the man that alerted about the plot down in New Orleans and that he could possibly have been murdered in order that they can use this same team if they need them later. The chain of command isn't broken, and white people would go into a black apartment, shoot, and leave. And that's exactly the way these other conspiracies come down. And so I still believe that New Orleans is a city where assassination teams exist all the time that would take care of public officials. There was another article in the paper this week about the airplane crash from 553, that's the United Airlines crash, that Mrs. Dorothy Hunt was on, the wife of E. Howard Hunt, defendant in the Watergate case. Congressman Jack Brooks from Texas is chairman of the powerful House Government Activities Committee. Now, this is not before the Senate Select Committee. They'll be meeting next week, but the House Governmental Activities Committee, and he is investigating the plane crash seriously. Also on his committee is Congresswoman Cardis Collins from Illinois. Now, Mrs. Collins is taking her husband's seat. Hale Boggs was dead this winter flying over Alaska, and I have information from two different sources about that airplane crash. Mrs. Boggs is taking his seat, representing him. But Congressman Collins was on this particular Government Activities Committee, and his wife has taken the seat, and she is sitting in. The former widow of George Collins, who was on the enemy White House list, who was killed on this plane crash, is also on this committee, filling the vacant seat of her husband's death. The decision by the Brooks Committee to probe the crash marks a major breakthrough in this case. I'm reading this from a newspaper article by David Collins, another Collins this week. The Government's Activities Committee, one of the most powerful on the Capitol Hill, overlooks the activities of various government agencies, including the National Transportation Safety Board and the Federal Aviation Board. You see, immediately after the crash, Mr. Butterfield, who was Richard Nixon's CIA babysitter and controller of the White House bugging and wiretapping, went right out to be head of the Federal Aviation, and A. Jill Crow went out to be charge of the National Transportation Safety Board, and Dwight Chapin of the espionage team went to Chicago to United Airlines. And Richard Nixon and company thought that they had all these three agencies covered by sending his top agents out after the plane crashed, where 80 FBI agents were at the field at the time it crashed. But the Brooks Committee is going into it. They've interviewed Sherman Skolnick from Chicago, who has all the evidence of the plane being tampered and the sabotage. They find, this is from the Boston Globe, they find Skolnick's charges of murder and sabotage to be correct. Now, the Rolling Stone has an article this last week out on Sherman Skolnick. I understand it's not favorable to him. I cannot understand it. The accident happened in December, and Skolnick made these charges immediately, had press conferences because of Alex Bottas, his researcher, being at the plane field at the time the plane crashed. We're going into almost a year later. This is the first week in September. The government is at a standstill at this case, so I don't know why the Rolling Stone has to have an article putting down Sherman Skolnick's efforts when he's doing so much to bring it out. I think we should stay objective and examine the evidence, because Congress is holding this evidence. The Boston paper went on to say that the Brooks Committee have interviewed Sherman Skolnick and Alex Bottas over the July 4th holiday when most people were vacationing. They were working, and they have information. And what the article says, on the steps of the Capitol, Skolnick accused President Nixon of complicity in covering up the murder of Mrs. Hunt. So while the nation was taking their vacation, a few other people have been working very hard. The article concludes by saying the quiet atmosphere in Washington is in effect only the calm before the storm, with one of the most powerful committees in Congress looking into murder and sabotage connected to the Watergate affair. The article I finished for the Realist mentioned 7 people that were murdered connected to the Watergate affair that only handled the money part of it, transaction of money. Mrs. Hunt was one of them. It doesn't include all the other passengers on that airline that went down with Mrs. Hunt. I read in the LA Times, I'm going to jump now to another subject, that's also depressing. We can do a 4-hour talkathon, maybe do everything sad this week and hope to be happy next week. I don't know. I read in the paper that the Chicano Party in Los Angeles wants to put a governor on the bill for the next California elections. La Raza is a Chicano group of Mexican Americans that hope by 1974 that they can get a governor. Now, it's very interesting. Wherever 4 Chicanos got together politically, they were infiltrated by a ratio of 2 to 4, just like the Vietnam veterans against the war. They were completely infiltrated with agents. And all of a sudden, they have gotten themselves 67,000 eligible voters to get themselves registered. Well, this reminds me that they're going to be betrayed. What they're going to do is to get help from the Republican Party and from the government through funding like the White House funded the American Nazi Party, the Peace and Freedom Party, the American Independent Party. These people were funded to draw votes away. Well, the American Independent was told to register with the Republicans this time around and not split it, and the Wallace Party was forced or begged them to split partly with the Democrats. The funding of Segretti and Kalmbach went into manipulating these parties so that the Republican candidates would get the most votes. And in this case, if the Chicano Party registers like the Peace and Freedom and gets support to build up a governor on this ticket, it guarantees that Ethel Younger would become the governor, or it pretty well would guarantee it, because you're taking all these votes away from the Democrat. And they may say, well, what has the Democratic Party done for us? But a lot of people were disenchanted with Governor Brown. They didn't want him, and they figured, what difference is there, Ronald Reagan? Well, just read the statistics of what's happening in the criminal department, the prisons, the welfare, the nursery schools, everything, the education, the funds for schools, for programs of learning, occupations, trades, anything this state needs, you name it, it isn't going to the people of this state. It's going to the handful of people offshore. Oil will come in, the drilling, and the conglomerates, the forces that control the oil, the sea around us, the land, the parks, are going to make it tighter. The lumber is being cut down. I read a few weeks ago, Office of Management budgets cutting down forests and not replacing them for the lumber people. It makes a difference who's the governor in this state. And it's very important that the Chicano Party doesn't split their vote this next election, or it's going to be a very sad day for those people and for all of us if we don't pull together and stop what is referred to by themselves as their Gestapo. Louis Tackwood used to speak about Ethel Younger's pleasure in describing a Gestapo someday. The California law enforcement do want a Gestapo, and we're linked to the national one in the White House. I called a friend of mine who knows people in La Raza and tried to tell her the urgency that people all pull together for this next election at least, and think about, we're in 73, think about 74. So a friend brought over a newspaper for me put out by La Raza so I could write an article for them and state the reasons why they shouldn't splinter off at this time. And while I read the newspaper of La Raza, I came to an editorial section. On the back, I was going through it to get the address of where to write to these people and send them an article. And there's an editorial in there that says, secret plan to make the U.S. all white. And this was in the paper. It said, vital information has reached El Grito, that's the paper that's published down in L.A., from a person who worked during the late 60s with military intelligence in the Pentagon, where he had top security clearance and access to secret documents. According to this person, there's a top-secret plan for the military takeover of the United States. The name of the plan is Heliotrope. Its target date is 1976. It calls for the seizure of Congress, assassination of numerous congressmen, a complete takeover by the military together with big business. Heliotrope involves high-ranking Pentagon officials, the CIA, the Green Beret, and members in all branches of the services, even the Coast Guard. After this turn is carried out, a new plan goes into effect called Turn Sol. This calls for the rounding up of all non-white people and eliminating them. No person who is more than 1/4 non-white is going to survive. This means the extinction of all Mexican, Indian, Black, Latino, Oriental, and mixed people. This information came from a person not mentally unstable, who was not drunk at the time he related it, to the military madmen behind these plans, to Nixon, who has already tried to make himself a dictator. We say such plans will never be allowed to go into effect. To Raza and all our sisters and brothers, we must awaken now and understand what could happen to us. We must take off the blinders that make some of us still think the U.S. is a democracy. We should remember that all the Jews in Germany said it couldn't happen here, and then 8 million were killed. It did them no good to stay home, minding their own business. We don't want our people to learn too late. They should have supported or joined those fighting the system. And it's signed El Grito staff. So in the same paper, on one side of the sheet, they're talking about a plan to exterminate all the whites, and on the other side, they're saying, let's run our own governor. And you see the ironic twist of them assuring themselves that they will get, in fact, what Turnbull guarantees. Well, I've been doing a lot of work comparing this heliotrope. This is the first time I've seen this Pentagon suggestion of the Pentagon heliotrope, but I have read on the program the National Security Council plan for the King Alfred plan. Now, I don't know, it's been a long time, maybe a year or two, since I read that on this program, but I'll read it to you now because of the trial coming up at San Quentin, of the San Quentin Six, and the Monterey Herald and the New York Times have Tom Wicker's story of the Attica trial in New Jersey riot, trying two people for a riot that killed 23 blacks in New Jersey, and the extermination of the blacks is moving back. It's moving ahead at such a speed that I thought I would just mention again this King Alfred plan, which is written up. It was printed in a book, The Man Who Cried I Am, by John Williams. But I have a copy of it that didn't come from the book. This one is photographed, and it isn't from the book copy. This is supposed to be from the National Security Council. It's called King Alfred. It says, in the event of widespread and continuing and coordinated racial disturbances in the United States, King Alfred, at the discretion of the President, is to be put action immediately. Participating federal agency is the National Security Council and the Department of Justice. It involves the CIA, the FBI, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Interior. Participating state agencies under federal jurisdiction with state police and National Guard. Now remember how the National Guard come in at New Jersey, at Attica, at Kent State, and they're doing these massacres. And remember the interagency plan in 1970 that was put into effect that Richard Nixon signed. The King Alfred plan is a systematic way of getting rid of all the blacks in the United States, and it goes down the line. I don't have time now. I'll go back to it, but I want to read another letter I wrote this weekend. But the plan is broken down. It's that even before 1954, when the Supreme Court of the United States of America declared unconstitutional separate educational and recreation facilities, racial unrest and discord had become a part of the American way of life. And that way of life is repugnant to most Americans. So since 1954, there's a solution to end minority racial war, and that emergency, when it comes, will take the total involvement of 22 million members of that minority. And I have a copy of a map where it's broken down into districts: the Capital Region, the Northwest, the Southwest, the Great Lakes, the South Central, the West Coast, the Southwest Region, 10 geographical areas. Their dossiers compiled on the leaders of the organizations. They are studied in Washington, and they have government posts, and they promise to get rid of them. Now, they have listed under 24-hour surveillance the Black Muslims, the Nonviolent Committee, SNCC, the Congress of Racial Equality, the Group for Advanced Leadership, Freedom Now Party, and there's 12 organizations where the leaders would be detained. Well, when you add up Medgar Evers and Malcolm X and Whitney Young and Powell and Congressman Powell and the group of black leaders, Eldridge Cleaver kicked out of the country and George Jackson murdered, this is a very detailed plan on what to do right down to 0 hour, from the 8th hour down to the 0 hour, signed by the Secretary of Defense. These two documents, in light of, if I'd said them a year ago, and I did read the King Alfred plan a year ago, you would say that's crazy. She's a crazy woman. But when you see the plans that went into operation at the White House that were exposed just by the John Dean papers, can you imagine how much more there is to reveal. I'll go back